Do I think gluten is a problem for Hashimoto's? Yes. Do I think people can be helped out by removing it from their diet? Also yes. Hey everyone, Dr. Brad Bodel here, and thank you for joining me today as we talk about everything you need to know when it comes to gluten and Hashimoto's. Now, gluten is a generalized term for a group of proteins found in wheat, barley, and rye. And chances are, some of your favorite foods probably include gluten, whether it's pasta or pizza, cookies or cake. But how did this little protein that's been such a big part of food and culture for so long suddenly start to become an issue for so many people? Well, in today's video, we're going to talk about all the theories as to why gluten can be an issue for people, especially those with Hashimoto's. We'll talk about the pros and cons of different types of testing. We'll go over the best ways to remove gluten from your diet if you're looking to maximize your results. And we'll also answer that big question, which is, can I ever have gluten again? But I do hope that you find today's information helpful. And if you are enjoying the content, please remember to like, subscribe, and if you have any questions, leave a comment. Now, I know sometimes when I start videos, I'll say, we're going to cover X, Y, and Z, but before we get to that, we have to cover this. And I'm going to do a little bit of that today. And the reason for that is if you came to this video just wondering, I have Hashimoto's, should I have gluten? I'm going to start off and bury the lead a little bit and say, if you are coming in to see me and we are trying to improve inflammation, immune system tolerance, gut health, a lot of these things that pertain to autoimmunity and Hashimoto's, then my answer is yes, we are going to get you off gluten, especially if you're having symptoms. And if that's not something that you're willing to do, I respect you. I'm not going to force you to do anything that you don't want to. But in my clinic, that is going to be a piece of our strategy. And I think it is something that's important. I think it's borne out by the research and also something that we see to be very effective on a clinical level. But I just wanted to address that right off the top. That way we're being honest with one another, and that way we both know what direction we're going in. But back to our original question, which is, why are more people seeming to struggle with gluten? And especially people with Hashimoto's and people with autoimmunity. And the quick answer is, we still don't know. There's a lot of different theories, some with more merit than others, and in my opinion, it's probably a combination of a few different things, but it is something that is still actively going on in the research. Some of the big theories include things like, we're eating way too much. Gluten intake has tripled in the past 40 years, and too much of anything can become a bad thing. Even something like having too much fruit, eventually that doesn't do very well with your stomach. And so with the too much theory, it's not necessarily that gluten is bad, it's just that we're overdoing it. The next theory is that wheat has changed, and it's true. Wheat has been hybridized in a number of different ways, and the amount of gluten has increased in these crops due to the fact that farmers, or maybe not farmers, but industrial engineers, are trying to find ways where, one, their crops are more resistant to drought and disease, and also there's better outcomes when we use it in food processing and baking. But due to this hybridization process, that's a lot to say, the wheat looks different potentially to our body. And our immune system and our gut, they're always trying to identify, is this something that's safe for me? Is it a food? Or is it something that I don't recognize at all and could potentially be some sort of an infection? So the more that we change and tweak and affect the protein structure of a particular food, the more likely it is that our body starts to struggle with recognizing it. So with this particular theory, because the wheat has been so dramatically changed, now we react to it because we're not sure what to do with it. The next theory is somewhat similar to the hybridization theory, but in this case, it's not because the actual wheat itself has changed. Instead, it's because the wheat has been combined with other types of chemicals. Crops are sprayed with pesticides, and this combination of food protein plus pesticide could potentially create what is called a neoantigen, or some sort of formulation that, again, our body has never seen before. Once that exposure occurs, your body can actually create antibodies for that food protein portion of the food protein pesticide combination. And when it's exposed to the food combined with the pesticide or not, that antibody can fit to either compound, and therefore it can be more reactive in any one of those situations. That means that potentially, if we're holding this theory as being kind of the one, if you were to start reacting to gluten because of this combination of the pesticide with the food, then even if you were to switch to a potentially healthier option like an organic bread or something like that, then it wouldn't matter. The antibodies are still present for the gluten protein, and so whether the pesticide is there or not, you're still going to have that same reaction. But hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you're still hanging with me. We only have a few more to go. The next theory is the last one that has to do with the food itself, and then the last few are more about how our bodies have changed. But the funny thing about this one is it actually doesn't really have much to do with gluten at all. This theory is that it's all about the FODMAPs. And as you may have seen in some of my videos before, FODMAPs are fermentable types of carbohydrates, and for some people, they can cause us a lot of digestive issues. So this theory says it's not the gluten, it's just a coincidence that gluten is in these other foods that are also high in FODMAPs, and that's where our focus should be. Wheat, barley, and rye are high in a type of FODMAP called fructans. And there has been research done where there are 3 groups. One group has a control bar, the next group has a bar that has no gluten but is high in fructans, and the last bar is the reverse. It's high in gluten, but there are no FODMAPs in it. And some of these studies have suggested that, yeah, when you go back and look at inflammation and immune system response, it's not the gluten, it's the FODMAPs. And that's why you'll see some of these dietary recommendations cropping up that are low FODMAP in nature rather than inherently gluten-free in nature. But because there is a fair amount of overlap, sometimes it's tough to tell really what's doing the heavy lifting there. And finally, the last few theories are all about changes in the human body. Essentially, we can't tolerate the gluten. So before it was, it's not me, it's you, the gluten. Now it's more of the reverse. That's what gluten's saying to us as it's trying to break up with us. These include the sterile environment theory, which is that throughout all of human history, we've always been exposed to a lot of infectious bugs. And these days, that number is much less. Because of that, the immune system isn't properly trained, and therefore it becomes more hypersensitive to things that generally should be innocuous. The next theory is the vitamin deficiency theory, which is a result of our food not being as nutritious as it used to be. And when we're missing out on some of these key compounds, our immune system can't function properly, and therefore when it does come in contact with some more complex proteins, like gluten is, it tends to be more reactive rather than more tolerant. And finally, our last theory is the gut flora theory. And this is that due to changes in our microbiome from increased exposure to chemicals, pollution, medications, we can't digest our food as well, absorb nutrients, we're at increased risk of leaky gut or intestinal permeability, and this all creates an environment where, in general, some of these more reactive proteins aren't something that interact well with us, that we don't tolerate well, and leads to systemic symptoms. Now that might have been more information than you needed, and although I do think research is really important and it helps us to understand mechanisms, to some degree, at the end of the day, when it comes down to you, it's more of a question of, does this make me feel good or does it not? But the reason I wanted to run through some of that is because I think it helps to give us some context and at least options when something isn't responding or working right when we initially make changes. So if you're someone who notices, yeah, I do tend to be more sensitive to chemicals, then maybe that can help you to lean into strategies that helps not only to change your nutrition, but also helps you to offload some of that chemical load. And the same thing could go for something like with the FODMAP theory. Maybe you notice a pattern where a lot of the foods that you do react to tend to fall into that category where they have higher amounts of fermentable carbs. And so you can start to tweak your nutrition around that sort of structure and maybe get some better outcomes. So as always, it's a little bit about categorizing things in a way where you can better understand what's going on with your body That way you can make choices and strategies that match that particular mechanism. But no matter what, you might have noticed as we went through that list that if you have Hashimoto's, well, we know that your immune system isn't functioning properly. We know that you probably have some sort of GI or gastrointestinal dysfunction. We know your detox pathways aren't as efficient, and we know that you can be more sensitive to different allergens and chemicals in your environment. So if you combine all these things and then put a protein, which is complex, hard to digest, and potentially is more reactive when it comes to your immune system, then it's pretty easy to see why gluten can be one of those more inciting factors that can contribute to the development of Hashimoto's and also contribute to the perpetuation of your symptoms. But instead of wondering, many of you might be asking, why don't we just test? And I'm going to once again kneecap this discussion right at the beginning and say that I don't do food sensitivity testing. I don't find it to be very helpful, and I think sometimes the results that we can get from the testing can actually lead to more confusion. The thing is, when it comes to gluten, most of the testing is either focused around testing for celiac disease or doing a blood IgG test for the protein alpha-gliadin. These tests are fine, but here's my issue with them. When it comes to celiac testing, not everyone who reacts to gluten has celiac, and that's why we have the definition non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which was for a while a bit of a gray area. Some practitioners didn't believe that it's a real thing, but the evidence is in, and we know that people have real physiological responses even in cases where they don't have celiac. But the other thing that we should consider is we all know, well, hopefully we know from watching some of my stuff, that autoimmunity is a progression. It usually doesn't happen overnight. And so it's possible that someone who is on the way to developing celiac disease could have all of those parameters in place for that to occur, but they're not there yet. Just like someone with Hashimoto's could have antibodies, inflammation, and symptoms, but there isn't enough damage to actually officially call it Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. Your TSH and your T4 are still normal, and therefore you don't meet those parameters. So let's say you have gas, bloating, and stomach pain whenever you eat gluten, but they do some testing, they biopsy your small intestine, and they say, nope, everything looks fine, you can continue to eat gluten, but if things continue, come back in a year and we'll check it again. Essentially what they're saying is, yeah, you have symptoms, but we're just going to wait for things to get worse, and then maybe we'll do something about it. But for some reason in the medical community, there's this fear that if they make some sort of nutritional recommendation, we'll all develop a complex and we won't be able to figure things out from then on out. But in my opinion, most people just want the information and the instructions for how they can feel better. When it comes to the IgG test for alpha-gliadin, yes, it's a valid test, but it's only testing one type of antibody response to one type of protein within the gluten complex. And if this test comes back negative, most of the time doctors will say, well, your gluten test came back as negative, so you can eat as much as you want. But what they really should be saying is that you don't have an IgG response to alpha-gliadin. They don't mention that there's a number of other proteins within the gluten umbrella, and it's possible we could have other types of immune responses to those proteins. Now, there's no way that we can test all those different immune responses to all those different proteins. It's something that we don't have available in labs, and it's something that would become very expensive. The reason they run it is because it's the most common type of reaction, but it isn't the only one. And finally, the last common test is one that most people are familiar with when it comes to allergies, which is the skin prick test, which is looking for an IgE response to whatever you're testing. It has the same issues as the blood test in that it's just one type of response to whatever protein you're picking, and although it can be helpful, we don't want to overgeneralize the results. Essentially, what you need to know is that all of these tests are fine, but they're limited in their scope and they're limited in what they tell us. If any of these tests come back as positive, then it is more likely that you are reacting to some sort of protein within the gluten complex, and you need to be careful about your consumption. But if they come back as negative, then it's not necessarily a get out of jail free card. Our reaction to gluten can be nuanced. both on the side of the type of protein that we're responding to and the way that our immune system is dealing with it. So instead of using these tests as 100% confirmation, I always prefer to do an elimination followed by a reintroduction and observe how things change. But if we do think we're reacting to gluten, or if we're trying to improve our Hashimoto's symptoms, what does that actually look like? And when it comes to my patients, there's a few different things that I recommend. First is, going gluten-free doesn't mean trading gluten foods for processed gluten-free foods. Meaning, we don't want to take bread, remove bread, and then just choose the gluten-free bread. Instead, we should choose foods that are naturally gluten-free. Not only does this help us to avoid getting too many processed foods in our life, but it also often gives us better results to judge our change from. What do I mean by this? Well, gluten-free foods can be listed or labeled as gluten-free if they have less than 20 parts per million of gluten protein in that food. And do you know why that threshold or that metric was chosen? It's because 20 parts per million is the amount that can be reliably detected on lab testing. So it's not really that if you have less than 20 parts per million, you won't react to the gluten, and if it's more, you will. Instead, it all comes down to the processing, to the testing. And it is possible that someone who is very sensitive could still react to gluten in a particular food even if it's on that lower amount, even if it doesn't come up on the standard testing. This is where you'll hear people say, I tried going gluten-free, but it really didn't work for me. I didn't notice any changes. And that's because they didn't really change their diet and they were still exposing themselves to gluten, even though they didn't know it. Now, of course, not everyone's sensitive to gluten, and maybe that wasn't the right strategy for that person. But in my opinion, choosing those processed gluten-free foods really isn't a fair trial. The other issue with those foods is although they don't contain wheat, barley, or rye, they contain a lot of other grains that don't have gluten in them, but they have proteins that have a similar structure to gluten. Now, in a healthy and stable environment, maybe your body does only react to gluten that's found in wheat, and it doesn't react to the proteins that are found in something like millet. But if your body isn't healthy, your immune system isn't functioning well, your gut isn't functioning well, then it is possible that some of these other proteins that look similar can cause a cross reaction. In the same way, you might walk up to someone in the store from behind and say, "Oh, hey, it's my friend." And they turn around, it's not your friend. Worst moment ever. You confused one person for the other because you didn't have full information to what they actually look like. And if our gut is already struggling to break down foods, it's possible that our immune system can confuse one protein for another. And when it's not interpreting things properly, then it's more likely to react to either one of those proteins. Now, can some of these alternative grains and grain replacements potentially be a good option for you in the future? Yeah, I do think they provide us that option. But in the beginning, for people who have severe symptoms and their symptoms are very chronic, sometimes it's a good idea to just clear the board, start fresh, and remove both grains that include gluten and grains that don't. Again, you can always add those things back in later once you're feeling better. And the last thing you may want to consider when removing gluten is that sometimes food reactions aren't all about gluten. Yes, it's the one that's most commonly talked about. Yes, we're talking about it today. But sometimes people can go gluten-free, they can remove those other grains, they can minimize their processed foods, but because they're still reacting to something like dairy or soy, and these are things that they're keeping in their diet and they're continuing to trigger their system, then their ability to assess that gluten removal really becomes hampered. Sometimes we have to combine strategies, and by removing multiple potential offenders at one time, just like with the cross-reactive grains, we can get a better sense of where we're at, and we can add those things back in later. And that brings us to our final question, the big question, which is, if I take gluten out now, does that mean I can never have it again? But like I said earlier in the video, I'm not here to tell you what you can and can't have, what you should or shouldn't do. I'm just trying to provide information, that way you can make the best decision for yourself. Do I think gluten is a problem for Hashimoto's? Yes. Do I think people can be helped out by removing it from their diet? Also yes. but I can also almost guarantee that you're probably going to have it again. So how do we approach that situation? Well, here's how I talk about it with my patients. My goal is always to have my patients heal and feel their best. But at the same time, I want them to be able to understand how their body works and what strategies support them in the best way. When they're not feeling well and they have a lot of symptoms, it can be really hard to tell what's working for you and what's not. But once you start to get your energy back, lose weight, your joint pain goes down, your brain fog lifts, then things become a lot clearer. And not just because the brain fog is better. Now, when something pops up, whether it's eating gluten, which isn't on your plan, getting a bad night of sleep, or having a lot of stress in your life, you can easily see how that impacts how you feel. And although flare-ups are never fun, they do give us perspective and we can learn from them. We can say, okay, when that goes wrong or when I do that, this is going to be the consequence. But once we have that cataloged and documented, now the choice is truly yours. Some of my patients know that they feel terrible when they have gluten. And others, maybe they don't feel terrible, but they just feel off or they don't like it. But in either situation, maybe their priority is feeling their best as much as possible. And they know eating gluten isn't conducive to that goal. Well, for those people, they might choose to always avoid gluten. And whenever they have the opportunity or if they want to have some sort of celebration or special occasion, they find ways to create that food in a way that doesn't involve gluten as an ingredient. Some of my other patients might say, yeah, it can make me feel terrible and I realize that now, or it doesn't help me to feel my best. But maybe feeling my best all the time isn't my main goal. Maybe I like to participate in certain celebrations and family events, and I'd like to have the actual food that's being prepared. I might not feel my best the next day, but that's a compromise that I'm willing to make. But whether you're someone who's avoiding it forever, choosing a middle ground where you're finding different types of replacement foods, or someone who wants to indulge from time to time, all of those options can be great options. And again, it comes down to what you want. Gluten is something that can flare up your symptoms. And if you consume too much of it too frequently, then it can potentially derail your health goals. But as long as you're aware of how it affects your body, then that's a decision that you get to make. But I hope you enjoyed today's discussion on gluten and Hashimoto's. And as always, if you have a question, leave it for me down below and I will do my best to answer it. If you found the information helpful but know you need additional support and want to work with me one-on-one, then you can start that process by requesting a free consultation by sending an email to my clinic at contact@seattlethyroidhelp.com. Once we hear from you, my staff will reach out to see if you qualify for the consultation. Then you and I will get to sit down, discuss your health goals, and see if we're a good fit to work together. We always want to make sure that you're in the right place for you and that all of your questions are answered. If you'd rather make some changes at home, you can check out any of my other videos on the channel, or you can grab either one of my free downloads, which are linked in the description box. The first one pertains a little bit more to today because it talks about the food recommendations that I make for a lot of my people with Hashimoto's. But that's all for right now. I know I say this every week, but I love and appreciate you guys, and the support you provide is absolutely amazing, and I can only hope that I'm providing you some sort of support as well. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me, and if you don't already follow me on Instagram and Facebook, links for that are down below. But my name is Dr. Brad Bodel. I hope that you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next Thursday.